This evening, I want to tell you about the centennial of E.H. Scott, and you'll see in a few minutes here why I'm going to say it's a centennial. I'm going to try and talk mostly about E.H. Scott and his primary radios through the time that they produced them, and focus a bit on the beginnings and the end of the Scott era, which are parts that people don't know as much about as seeing the radios that we're all very familiar with. So, to begin, these are a couple of photos I recently acquired of Scott's parents. Scott was born June the 1st, 1887. His father worked for the railroad in New Zealand, and he died in an accident in 1891 when Scott was just 4 years old. His mother passed away in 1905. In 1912, Ernest married a lady there in nearby in New Zealand named Jessie Tucker, and they moved then to Melbourne, Australia. And Mr. Scott filed his first U.S. patent in November of 1914, and I'm going to come back to that. But like most people at that time, he was interrupted by World War I. Scott, of course, served. He enlisted voluntarily with the Australia-New Zealand forces in January of 1916, and he wound up in the north of France in later that year. He served there in the motor pool and vehicle supply area, working on some of the various trucks and so on that they had at the time, which of course in 1918, 1916, 1970 was, rather by our standards, crude vehicles at that time. In 1917, he received an award for meritorious action and was promoted to corporal. But when the war ended, he left Europe via England and sailed to the United States. He came to the Chicago area because his brother George was already living there. Now we'll come back to his patent. Scott and the motor pool, Scott was there because his patent was related to a device that he had invented, which allowed you to do troubleshooting on motors. It looked at the carburetor, the ignition systems, and this patent was granted, and Scott sold actually a number of these test devices to both the French military and to the U.S. military. He claimed in a later document that he had actually sold about $50,000 worth of these testers, and that would be a significant sum. It would probably, converted to today's dollars, almost $900,000. So Scott was probably arriving in the United States a very wealthy fellow to begin with. But when he came here, that was what he was going to do. He offered his tester in a more modern version, a small carry case tester, and he called it the Scott Telecator. These devices were, again, for testing your car. He advertised them in a number of local newspapers, and he also modified the design that he had sold in World War I, and he put a key lock on it. So this was one of the first anti-theft key locks offered on a car if you put the Scott Telecator on and hooked it in. And they're actually quite scarce and difficult to find, but a few examples exist. They came in both a 4- and 6-cylinder version too. Now, Scott didn't just sell these, he made a name for himself syndicating newspaper articles on auto repair. So much like our old friend Atwater Kent, who got a big start in cars, Scott's beginning was also with automobiles, as you can see. He published a number of articles called The Troubleshooter. These were advertised in many little newspapers, and he did these under the name of the SNL Technical Syndicate. These are just some example articles that I've found over the years. I have no idea what SNL stood for. There doesn't seem to be any, I've never found any indication what those letters stood for, but he did sell those as the syndicated article. He had syndication across over 100 newspapers at its peak. He also published a couple of books on automobile repair in the early 1900s there. And the Troubleshooter Motor Book, is pretty much just a compendium of the many newspaper articles he wrote, organized into logical chapters. The Press Motor Book is a little bit different. And again, these are also very difficult to find. His syndicate, the SNL Technical Syndicate, offered two pieces of material for newspapers to take. One was his automotive troubleshooter guide. The other was a radio column. And the radio column was also quite popular and was always authored by a fellow named F.M. Russell. I don't personally believe that was like a name that Scott went under, because Scott was a very proud, very upfront marketing person. And if he wrote it, he would have had his name on it. I have done some research on F.M. Russell, and there was a Frank Russell who worked for RCA in the 1930s. It might be that same individual, but I've not been able to confirm that. But either way, the SNL Technical Syndicate, based in Chicago, with both Scott's automotive articles and the radio column, was a clear connection between Scott and radio. And he even authored at least one automobile article where he did a radio circuit. In this one, he talked about choosing camping sites and having a little radio set available for your trip. And that was probably a Scott designed circuit. So at this point, we're up to about 1923, 24, and Scott has made a name for himself in the auto industry, and he's, as I mentioned, fairly well off, living in a very good suburb of Chicago, has a number of business ventures going on. He and his wife wanted to go home to New Zealand to visit family, and so he began planning a vacation. Now, a vacation in 1924 back to New Zealand was a big effort. You were going to take a liner. It was probably going to take you at least 3 weeks by boat just to get there. And when you got there, you were probably going to stay a while before you turned back. So Scott wanted to take with him a radio that he could listen to Chicago radio stations. And so and I'm not going to read all the words here, but this is from his story that he published. And basically, he started testing in early 1924, summer of 1924. He claims, over 200 different radio circuits and experimented with them. And as he said in the last one there, you'll see, by the first week in October, the tests were finished and a receiver completed that proved itself. So literally 100 years ago, at about this time, Scott was finishing up the design of his very first set. In October and November, he was testing. And one of the things that he did from Chicago is he reliably received 2LO in London, in Chicago, on a regular basis. He actually had that receiver pick up 2LO so well that he put the folks at the Chicago Herald and Examiner newspaper on the telephone, and they could hear over the telephone the radio from London, and wrote up a certificate for him confirming that the set had received London with loudspeaker volume in Chicago. So this was what he took. This set was what he took then to New Zealand. And he and Jesse left in early December and arrived in their family area of Dunedin, New Zealand, on December the 23rd. And Scott enjoyed Christmas with the family, but immediately started working on radio reception. He logged his first reception from the United States on December the 27th, 1924. And he continued the whole time they were there through his last logged event there was April the 10th, 1925. They were there for about 4 months. And he, at that time, logged many different, this gives the list of his records that he claims for this set. He picked up stations not only on the west coast of the United States, but all the way up into Chicago regularly. This is a picture that he used quite frequently in his histories and talks about the radios. This was him with his set there in New Zealand and the original, what he called the world's record Super 9. So the Super 9 was in fact a super het. There were some unique things about his super het design that might have made it good. I mean, it was a fairly typical super het for 1924. He did have a regenerative detector on it. He had done some other things. If you'll notice there, a lot of the wiring and the tube sockets are up on these stilts, these phenolic poles, and that was to shorten the lead so that the tube sockets could be connected directly to the IF units there. The other big difference in his set was that most of the designs, including the Gerald Best sets of that time, used what we called 3:1 ratio. They had 3 untuned IF stages and 1 tuned stage. Scott had 2 and 2. He had 2 untuned and 2 tuned stages. And further, if you see those small Remler type condensers mounted above the 2 tuned stages, he actually had trimming on the IF. You could actually tune those IFs with the small capacitor there, which I think is probably one of the earlier, what we would call a tuned IF set. And the other thing that he did that was a little bit unusual is he only used audio transformers with a 2-to-1 ratio because he liked the sound quality better, even though it did not give as much amplification. So there were some things that were unique about the set, but it was clearly a highly performing radio that he had with him. When he got back to the United States in 1925, he put together a 20-page booklet on how to build and operate his amazing set. And the booklet was offered for $5. He also offered a complete kit of parts, including an engraved panel, for $125, which was quite the sum in 1925. He started advertising. The earliest ad that I've ever found for the world's record was in the Radio Age magazine in November of 1925, where he advertised for the booklet. Very few of these early sets exist. There are a few. This one is not his exact set, but it's the earliest known that I have encountered. As you can see, the construction closely follows the pictures in the original guide. The set is, and by the way, this set uses Remler transformers at this point. Scott was using stock parts for the radio at this time. Thordarson transformers, Remler IFs, Remler coupler, those types of things. But Scott ran into a significant problem. In early 1926, I have some correspondence between himself and a couple of his customers, and Scott had what he called supply problems. Remler was unable to provide neither the quantity nor the quality of the IF transformers that Scott wanted. And so he started looking into winding his own IF transformers. And by 1926, Scott was creating what he called his selectone transformers, which look remarkably like Remlers, but and they came in a tuned and untuned version. As a matter of fact, Remlers were numbered 400 and 410, and Scott, or 600 and 610, and Scott would number his selectone transformers 400 and 410. So there was definitely parallels there. But he sold them, if you bought a set of his transformers, he sold them as a tuned match set. So at the laboratory, they would take the transformers and make sure that they were resonant at roughly the same frequency, and you get a matched set to build your radios. And these took off. He had his same model set with that, and then he started to branch out, and other magazines and newspapers started publishing more radio circuits. The first of those actually came back in 1926 even. The Chicago Evening Post radio magazine advertised a 10-tube circuit, which actually added another IF stage. This one has 3 untuned stages and 2 tuned stages. And Scott then continued on. We have, over the next year and a half, about a dozen different articles describing construction of Scott sets. We've got an 8-tube superhet in December of 26, a 9-tube in March of 27. We've shifted to 01As from the 99s. The Citizens Radio Call Book one, the March of 27 set, even used or called for WD 12 tubes in the IF stages. It's not clear if all of these articles were sanctioned by Scott. I think some of them were probably written by some of the radio designer articles in the magazines, but what it did do is it sold a lot of Scott select tone transformers. And Scott, of course, made hay with that and was quite happy to do it. And the fact that these were all kits kept him out of RCA's gun sights right now for superhets. Now, by the fall of 27, Scott made a fairly significant jump, and he repackaged his Selectone transformers in a sub-panel mounting, which allowed us to get back to a more normal design of having everything on the panel, and they still have the short leads to the tubes and so on through the IF stages. The world's record Super 10 was probably the finest of the battery sets that they came up with. This one was sanctioned by Scott. There were a number of articles that showed this set in Citizens Radio Call Book. Radio World had a 3-series article on building the world's record Super 10. And it was a winner for Scott because it required 8 Scott Selectone transformers. So he got to sell a lot of transformers. And there were even variations on this. There was one that was designed to have a phono input, and another article in Citizens Radio Call Book showed what they called an electric version, which used the Kellogg Type 401 tubes instead of 01As. None of those has ever been found, but they certainly played up the world's record Super 10 for a good long time. Now, radio was advancing pretty quickly, and Scott moved into the next area, which was the shield grid tube. And Scott's first entry in this is probably one of their more beautiful radios. The Scott Shield Grid, world's record Shield Grid 9, came out in April of 1928. Everything was copper plated, and the set uses the new Type 22 shield grid tubes, which provided a tremendous amount of gain in the IF stage. The set is a wonderful performer when restored. The other thing Scott did with this set for the first time is he made it an all-wave set. And it had plug-in transformers so that you could go for 2 other shortwave bands on the Shield Grid 9. These transformers just plug in and plug out. It was fairly simple to use and to change. It was also a fairly easy set to build because the large copper box in the center, which was the IF line, was a sealed unit, and so there wasn't a lot of wiring. This allowed Scott to recruit kit builders to assemble these sets for his non-technical customers, and he really had a large number of people building radios around the United States and selling them. The Shieldred 9s turn up quite frequently. He did very well with this set. And again, because he was selling pieces and had people building them, he kept under the radar with RCA, even though he's well on his way with Superheads. And the Shieldred 9 was a monster set, as I said, came in everything from a table cabinet to a huge desk, which there's some pictures of Scott sitting at desk DXing with the set. It's just a beautiful radio. Scott was ever the marketing person. In the November of 1928, Scott placed a number of Shieldred 9 radios on Chicago and Northwest Railway trains out of Chicago. And that evening, they were calling election results on November the 6th, I believe, between Hoover and, I don't remember, was it Smith, I think? Anyway, they had a number of trains where they had, that's a picture of Mr. Scott demonstrating the radio and getting the election results on one of the trains. They had like I said, he made a name for himself by pulling what we would call stunts probably, but clearly making a Shieldred 9 set work on a rolling train was no small feat. So, and I'm going to say here that Scott went off the ranch right after this, and he created his very, very first AC set, which came out in April of 1929, was also unique in that it was the only non-superhet Scott ever built. He had a set called the Shieldred Symphony, and it is a little regenerative set. The units across the back are a power supply. The radio is actually just 4 tubes. It's a very simple circuit, and it was not a good performer. It was advertised for only a couple of months. There's ads in the April and May issues of a few magazines, and then the set simply vanished. I don't think Scott was overly impressed with its performance. It's not clear why they offered it, but it did give them a AC power supply and a basic design, which moved forward in his summer offering in 1929, which was the big Shieldred AC-10. This set was, again, copper plated. This was a fully assembled set. Scott put this together. It had a power supply that connected through 2 multi-wire cables. It had an electrodynamic speaker, so it had some pretty decent sound quality. The AC-10s were a nice performer, and Scott had not given up on his shortwave. In this particular case, he made an outboard shortwave adapter. You would remove one of the tubes from the set, put it inside the shortwave converter, put the appropriate waveband coil on top, plug the converter back into the tube socket, and your AC-10 went from AM to 3 different shortwave bands. So he had that going. And then another unique thing about the AC-10, he actually offered it as a remote control set. Similar to plugging in the shortwave converter, the remote control set has a small plug mounted on the back of the panel, which connects to a box which had several tuning capacitors in it. So you could preset, much like an early car radio, you could preset 8 stations on the remote control, and the other lead was the other control on the end was a volume control. So the set itself actually matches the patent. This was a patented thing that Scott did, and the set itself matches the patent almost exactly. That switch you see at the bottom of the patent is the switch you see in the picture in the lower left. The set aligns very closely with that. There was one last item from this era that I want to mention in Scott, and then we'll get into the 1930s. Actually, this was September of 1930. Citizens Radio call book, Scott didn't give up on cars either, and he offered an automobile radio. This was a one-page article in Citizens Radio call book. None of these have ever been found, but it was quite possible that Scott built a few. But of course, they're probably located in a collector car somewhere. Certainly don't turn up on the street. But he did offer an automobile radio receiver as well. So this kind of wraps up Scott's earliest years. And in 1931, January of 1931, Scott releases his first radio that we would recognize as a Scott, with the chrome chassis, a beautiful finish. He releases his Scott all-wave, what we call today the 2-dial set, separately tuned oscillator and RF. It came with 5 additional shortwave plug-in coils, one each for the RF and the oscillator. The set was very large, used 2 push-pull 45s, a 12-inch speaker, was a very nice, well, it had a 10 or 12-inch speaker depending, and it had very good tone quality, very sensitive set. It was not easy to operate. It required changing around a number of wires. Several grid leads had to be changed. The 2 coils had to be plugged in. It wasn't what you'd call a user-friendly set for shifting between shortwave and AM, but it was very effective, and it's a very good set. As was mentioned at the beginning, my father got me started on Scotts by finding a Scott set. This was the model Dad found to me, was the all-wave 2-dial, and was the first Scott that I ever restored to operating condition. Now, that set led to the all-wave deluxe receiver in May of 1932. Now, this set really was a jump in technology for Scott. Not only is it a single dial radio, but you'll notice that there are no plug-in coils. This has the Scott wave change system in it. This set actually comprises 4 new patents for Scott. It was a very significant development. The wave change switch, which if you've ever looked in a Scott, everybody, you're familiar with these. The wave change mechanism was one of the patents, one of the 4 patents that was granted on this set. And those turret tuners were used for a number of years. It was used up until the Philharmonic model in 1937. The other patent was a new tuning drive, which was, again, part of that single dial tuning system. This also provided some anti-backlash and was a very firm and smooth tuning mechanism that was patented. Also, it offered a tuning meter, which was backlit and showed through the clear plastic dial. That was also patented. That was one of the things that was unique to this set. And then I'm not quite sure how they did it, but the actual circuit of this set was patented as a complete radio receiving system. And again, I'm not quite sure how they got that one past the patent office, because it's certainly a nice set, but it wasn't terribly unique in its day. But the combination of all the different things, including the wave change system, probably convinced the patent office to grant the patent. Ernest Pfaff, E.R. Pfaff, who's on this patent, was at that time Scott's chief engineer and chief designer of these radios. And this was quite a set. It lasted from 1932 until 1934, 2 years, which was quite a long run for Scott. It underwent a couple of revisions. The most notable was that they added an AVC circuit to it, and that made the second detector a Wunderlich tube, which is kind of unusual, a little bit hard to find these days, but a great performing set. In 1934, Scott introduced in February the Scott All-Wave 15. This 15 tube set used two A3s in the output, pair of them, and was again an upgraded version of the All-Wave 12 with better audio. Now, this one was an evolutionary set. It was produced for just about a year, and I am become convinced over the years that no two All-Wave 15s are identical. It seems like they introduced changes to this set right along in the production run whenever they felt like it. Even Scott noted that there were 3 models of this with 3 different tube lineups, and this was a set produced for about 14 months. People ask me all the time, for a schematic for an All-Wave 15, I said, I'll give you the 7 that I have, but I can't promise your set will match any of them. This was a very evolutionary set. And at this same time, Scott was also offering 2-volt and 6-volt farm radios that did not have a power supply and separate power supply. They were battery operated for those in remote areas. Kind of scarce to find, but there are a few examples of both 2-volt and 6-volt versions of Scott all-wave sets in the 33-34 period. But all the tinkering in the all-wave 15 paid off because in 1935, Scott introduced what he called it initially the Imperial All-Wave. He quickly had to drop the Imperial name as that was being used by another radio company, and he had to stop using that name. So he renamed it the Scott Full Range High Fidelity Receiver. This is the All-Wave 23 that we all know today. This became Scott's biggest seller overall. And it was a tremendous radio. 4 2A3s, push-pull parallel. It had a 12-inch speaker with an optional tweeter set. It had AVC on both RF and the IF AVCs. The set had voltage regulated oscillator. It was a tremendous performer, beautiful sounding set. And Scott also began at this time to offer some of the really notable cabinets that we see these radios in. This is the beginning of Scott's golden era. For the next about 4 or 5 years, Scott's going to be at his heyday. We have some beautiful cabinets. We have the high-performing All-Wave 23. We have, again, just a number of really exciting things. And Scott modified the All-Wave 23. He had one of the things he offered with this set, he offered a phonograph with it. He offered the tweeters. He also offered an outboard volume expander, a little 4-tube unit that enhanced the volume, particularly bass response, fairly successfully. Scott made a version of the All-Wave 23 with that built in. We call that the All-Wave 27. There's quite a few examples of that around. But it all led to one gigantic set that everybody, kind of the holy grail set of Scott's, and that was his Quaranta, a 40-tube receiver that used 8 2A3s. It had a 5-speaker system. It was triamped. It had 3 separate channels, a high channel, a mid channel, bass channel, based largely on the All-Wave 23 tuner. It was just a monster set. We don't know exactly how many of them were sold. There are several examples, but it's doubtful that they probably built more than 10 or 12 of the giant Quaranta sets. And there are also some other variations on it. Again, Scott was a custom builder, so if a purchaser wanted something extra added, he got it. So this was the big ones. And by the way, the Quaranta and the 23 were the work of a new chief engineer. We're not quite sure when the Pfaff left the company, but around this time, new chief engineer joined Scott. His name was Murray Clay. And Murray came in and designed the next set, which was released in 1937. and is arguably Scott's flagship radio, the Scott Philharmonic. A 30-tube monster, 6 wave bands on it, and it sold for, as you can see, half the price of a new car at the time. The Philharmonic was a beautiful radio that Murray designed, and it had also, like the All-Wave 12 Deluxe a few years earlier, a number of patents associated with it. The set was noted for its fidelity, its sound. Scott offered very complex changer systems with it. You can see the set's very large, very complex. Murray Clay actually wound up with 4 patents for the Philharmonic, all in his name, assigned to Scott. The first was a new antenna coupler that he designed that was in the radio. And then the other 3 are all circuit designs. He had an RF rejection circuit that he had patented. He had a noise limiting circuit there in the middle, and he also had what he called his biresonant circuit in the audio, which was to provide greatly improved audio and bass response. And when we look at a schematic of the Philharmonic, the RF rejector is there. The noise limiter is found in the AVC area, and the biresonant circuit appears in the audio line. And the volume expander is built completely into this set. That volume expander circuit that they pioneered with the All-Wave 23 is incorporated in the Philharmonic. Now, the Philharmonic, as I said, sold for half the price of a new car. And Scott, sales weren't everything he'd hoped for. So Scott broke with tradition, because up to this point, he only ever had one model at a time. But in the summer of 1937, he introduced a lower end set called the 16. And the 16 was designed to be a low priced Scott set that an average person might be able to afford. And so they brought this one out. It's not a very pretty set as far as the face goes, but the Model 16 wound up selling about half as many units as they sold Philharmonics in its lifetime, and the Philly was produced for a lot longer than the 16 was. But this gave Scott a 2-tier sales approach. The 16 also had one other patent associated with Scott in it. George Roethel, who was on an earlier patent, came up with a different anti-backlash system in tuning, which is incorporated in the 16. George was with Scott for at least 15 years over the development of the radios. Never became chief engineer, but he was definitely one of Scott's better designers. In 1938, Scott came out with a new model called the Phantom. And this was actually introduced as a midline set. So he went to a 3-tier system in 1938. He had the lower cost radio in the 16. He had the Phantom, which was what he called his middle line. And then he still had the Philharmonic available. The Phantom was about $100 less than a Philharmonic, but a little bit more still, obviously, than the 16. The 16 had kind of run its course, and in the end of 1938, Scott introduced a single chassis set called the Super 12, and you can see the power transformer mounted on the rear of the radio. But Scott, again, much like the Symphony, was not impressed with this set and its performance, its sound, and within about 7 or 8 months, he had discontinued it in July of 1939. So the Super 12 was briefly the low tier, sold for $99, was the low tier Scott with the Phantom and the Philharmonic. When he got rid of that, though, he continued to have a low tier set, and he put in the Scott Masterpiece in June of 1939. And the Masterpiece name, if those recall, was what McMurdo Silver had been selling for a number of years. He had his Masterpiece 1 through Masterpiece 6 sets. by this time, Scott had bought out McMurdo Silver. And by putting his Masterpiece name on the low end of the Scott line, I'm sure it was intended to be something of a poke at McMurdo Silver. But the low end set was the Scott Masterpiece. It did use a pair of 6V6s. It did actually have pretty good sound and was a pretty nice set, but again, was the low end of the Scott line. So by the time we get here to 1939, we've got a 3-tier system: the Masterpiece, the Phantom, and the Philly. Much like the Quaranta in the 23, Scott at this time came out with another monster set, his Special Communications receiver. This set is basically a Philharmonic tuner with 2 completely separate front ends. The 2 lower wave bands are on one dial, and the other dial are the shortwave bands, and you can simply flip one switch and switch between the 2 tuners. It was also set up to be a ham or a operator's transmitting radio, because it does have an input to cut the radio off when you were transmitting. So it has a relay and the sensors for turning off the radio if you were talking on a ham set. The Special Communications receiver sold for $650, which was the price of a car at that time. We don't believe very many were built, but there are about 10 in existence today, and it is quite a set. By the way, the power supply for this is a Phantom power supply, unmodified, for the Special. So let's see, going on to one other interesting thing that Scott did at this time. He found a fellow by the name of Arno Tauscher, who had patented back in the early 30s what he thought was a system that you would put in front of a speaker that would help diffuse the sound. And Scott sold a number of Tauscher soundboards. Scott also patented a variation of that himself. The Tauscher soundboard was, well, I'll be honest, I removed them from all the Scott sets I find, and I have a number of them sitting on the shelf, because putting that much wood in front of a speaker really didn't help that much. So, but it was one of those things that he tried. Now, in 1939, Murray Clay also left the company in late 1938, and Scott hired a new chief engineer by the name of Marvin Hobbs. That name might be familiar. Marvin wrote a book about Scott, The Dean of DX, in the 1980s. But Marvin became Scott's chief engineer in 1939, and his first assignment with Scott was to develop an FM radio receiver. And Marvin took that on, and by early 1940, March actually, Scott introduced 2 new wideband FM receivers. He had a standalone FM tuner, which would go into the phono input of a Scott set. And they also added the FM circuit to the Masterpiece or the Phantom. Now, interestingly, the Masterpiece was dropped almost immediately, and only one example of an FM Masterpiece is known. But the Phantoms and later the Philharmonics were modified so that they had FM built in. The Phantom chassis didn't have enough space for the FM circuit, and so they literally bolted on the side of the first ones a 3-inch addition on the right side of the chassis, which held the FM lineup of tubes. It makes for a lopsided chassis. They later just made the whole chassis that shape in the FM sets. The Philharmonic wound up giving up its volume expander and a couple of other small things in the circuit to make room for an FM on the Philharmonic. The FM Philharmonics and Phantoms are both very dense sets in very deep chassis, about 4 inches deep. So they are a bear to work on today. But if you get them working, there's nothing to hear because it's 41 to 50 megahertz FM. It's pre-war FM. So we move on, and Marvin went on to design the last pre-war Scott set, the Scott Laureate, which was introduced in August of 1941, and we know where 1941 is going. So the Laureate, I don't think, gets quite the love that it should because, first of all, it's the only Scott chassis pre-war that was designed with FM in the original plan. And also, it was only produced for a few short months before the war began. There are actually very few Laureates out there. It is one of the scarcer 1930s Scott sets. And to that point, a lot of people ask me, how many sets did Scott build? Beginning with the all-wave deluxe in 1932, Scott put serial number plates on his sets. And we've been collecting, all credit where credit is due. June Pewitt started collecting serial numbers back in the 1970s. He obviously thought ahead and saw that coming. I have correspondence between him and some of the bigger collectors of the time, like Joe Halser and folks like that, who are early Scott collectors, the very, the original, the OG group for Scott collectors. They were collecting serial numbers. I've continued that process and now have over 2,100 Scott serial numbers. The numbers shown in the first column are how many I have for each set. And as you'll notice, the Laureate is extremely small there, as I mentioned. Based on high and low numbers for the sets, we have an estimate of how many are produced in the middle column. And over the years, it became more obvious that Scott reserved blocks of numbers for certain models. And if we look at the blocks, we get a different set there in the third column. But what you can see at the bottom of the second and third column, in round numbers, Scott produced between 1932 and the war, probably about 25,000 radios, give or take. And that was their total production of all models for those years. So if anybody wants to know, that's about what we're looking at out there. When you think about how many Philcos and RCAs are out there, there were about 25,000 Scott sets. Now we get to World War II. And Marvin is still with the company. And Scott talks about in his history a bit about the problem of radiating radios. It was known at the time that Super Hat particularly would radiate some signal out, and the German U-boats would triangulate on radio signals, find some of the merchant marine ships, and the subs were having a field day with some of the supply lines going across the Atlantic. And so the government put out an urgent call to develop a radio that would not radiate. And Scott answered that call. Marvin worked on that design and came up with the low radiation receiver system, which Marvin patented. This is the patent drawings, and as you can see, the design in production looks similar to the patent. These sets are undetectable more than 25 feet away. They don't radiate. They were AM and shortwave. And what they were largely sold for, they sold some to the military, but mostly these went to the merchant marine to provide sailors with, morale radios on the ships so that they could listen to things from home. Scott advertised this pretty heavily. He demonstrated this. The picture there was one I found. He was showing Thordarson Transformer Company employees the low radiation receivers and showing them how their transformers were being used in the war effort. And of course, Scott, being a veteran of World War I, was also very supportive of the war effort in World War II. And he wrote to many of his purchasers, his customers, and asked for contributions to the Anzac War Relief Fund And he did a number of things. If any Australian, New Zealand soldiers passed through Chicago, they were welcome at the laboratories, and Scott took great care of them during the war as they traveled. He was a big supporter of the war effort. And one other very, very unique radio that Marvin had the opportunity to work on, Marvin Hobbs, was he built a radio for President Roosevelt's aircraft, the Sacred Cow. This was one of the low radiation receivers. It had a small control panel, which was mounted in the president's cabin up along the armrest. And it worked the set, which was below the president's cabin, underneath in a hangar bay, all through remote mechanical shafts. So like a car radio had extended shafts. This was the same thing. It had a number of mechanical shafts going down, as well as several wires between the control panel and the radio. The radio is one of the low radiation models, slightly changed, basically the SLRF model. This set was given the designation of the AR-1, and it is in President Roosevelt's aircraft. That aircraft sits with all the other Air Force One sets or airplanes, which are located in Dayton, Ohio, at the Museum of the United States Air Force. If you want to go see them, all the Air Force One planes are there, and you can actually walk through the Sacred Cow. And if you know where to look, you can see the control panel in the president's cabin. It's kind of at an angle, but you can see it. The set is in the aircraft. So that's kind of a unique piece that they built. Now we'll get down to the end. In 1945, at the end of the war, Scott was really antsy to get home to New Zealand, very antsy. He pulled strings and got an early transport pass and went to New Zealand, and then he got stuck, and he couldn't get back. He begged Australia and New Zealand to help him. He finally got back to the United States on June the 5th of 1945, but by the time he got back, he had found that his company had been taken over by Hal Darr and some other individuals. He had been demoted to sales manager. They had sold about $250,000 in public stock, effectively taking his company public. And so he resigned. He took out a full-page ad in the Chicago Sun, completely disclaiming any affiliation with the company whatsoever. It was a big deal. In Time magazine on July 9th, 1945, Time magazine ran an article called Hail and Farewell and talked about Scott being run out of his company and leaving the radio business. And he did too. He and Jesse moved up to Victoria, British Columbia, completely left the Chicago area. Scott took his last years and became a movie producer, film and movies. He took video, or well, not videos, but movies, actual, 16 millimeter movies. He traveled to Mexico, Brazil, New Zealand. He showed these little travelogues at various events. As he did so, the company closed its doors in Chicago in 1947 and moved out to Plymouth, Indiana. Scott continued with his movies. In 1951, he was made a member of the Amateur Cinema League and produced a movie called The New Zealand Holiday. And he was quite successful there, doing a number of things with movies. And unfortunately, in October of 1951, October 27th, Scott fell suddenly ill and passed away that day, leaving himself as a legacy. There's some news articles there about his legacy as a filmmaker, radio man, and everything. The picture on the right, for those who are familiar with cigarette cards and tobacco cards, In New Zealand, one of the cigarette companies, upon his passing, created an E.H. Scott cigarette card, noting that he was a notable New Zealander in the radio business. He was honored quite a bit in New Zealand at the time. And so there he was, gone at the age of 64. And that's kind of the story of E.H. Scott and the company. The company ultimately went bankrupt in 1956. He didn't live to see it, thank heavens. And that was kind of the end.